This conference will now be recorded.
And so we just leave it there all the time.
Yes.
And what do we do with this?
Normal voice, as if you are
Okay.
To switch to, just normal voice.
speaking voice.
Okay?
Yell into the microphone?
Don't sound.
Okay, got it.
It will pick you up, you don't have to lean into it or anything.
Okay.
But be sure you're like projecting to a full room.
As we go through, you want to do a little bit of, after you do presentation on a question, do a little bit of talk between us on that question?
I think so.
And then we move on, and then we
Yeah.
wait for their questions at the end. But, so,
I'm just referring all questions to Ron. All questions are being referred to Ron.
he hasn't picked up on that. He's over there with Zach. He's in a daze. It'll be interesting afterwards to hear comments on how many people watch it compared to how many people listen to it, so.
Hey guys on the phone, if you will go ahead and put your phones on mute, there will be a portion of time towards the end where we'll tell you guys you're unable to unmute your phones and ask questions, but for right now, please put your phones on mute. Thank you so much.
Make sure we're all on silent in the room.
Oh, yeah. Good call.
So we'd introduce you off the bat here, and we'll,
Sounds good.
okay. We're down to about the final minute here, so. Okay, I think we've reached 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and fire up. I'm Rob Moselle, the president of Oklahoma Farm Bureau, and this is our second time to try using webinar technology. The last time was audio only, so we're excited today to be partnering with the State Chamber of Oklahoma to do a presentation on the 5 state questions that are on the ballot in November. And so we're delighted to have with us today former State Representative Mike Jackson, who's also got some good agricultural roots, since we've got I'm sure a lot of our audience today is going to be folks that are from the Farm Bureau, although we'll probably have some members that are from State Chamber and from other groups as well. So, but he has a good understanding of rural Oklahoma and agricultural issues as well. So we're delighted to have this chance to team up with the State Chamber today and kind of go through the different state questions that every one of us as citizens will not only be deciding on governor and on congressman and on state house and state senate members this year, but we do have these important state questions, and they can be hard to get up to speed on. They can be hard to get good information on, and that's why Mike's joining us today to talk about these.
Thank you very much. Of course, Farm Bureau has been a fantastic partner to the State Chamber. As a former legislator, a former Speaker Pro Tem, I think in my time frame I had 100%. I was one of those 100%ers. I actually have it in my office. So I have been a long supporter, a long member of Oklahoma Farm Bureau, and really appreciate everything you do. We're delighted to be here today and just to talk a little bit about the 5 state questions that you will be seeing on your November ballot.
I think we might as well get started.
Okay.
I'm not sure which one you have up first on the slide here, but those that are getting to watch on video, you'll get to see a slide, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion about that afterwards. We get the technology going here. And we're taking another shot here to get get all the buttons working right. I think, are they coming up in order? This first one's going to be 793.
Yes.
And so while we're getting the screen to work right, I'll tell you this is the one would change the rules on optometry.
This is the one that you've probably seen the most about so far. There's a lot of activity from TV and radio and all those types of things right now. So what State Question 793 does, this measure guarantees optometrists and opticians the right to practice and sell prescription optical goods within a retail store. It also gives the legislature power to impose certain health and safety standards, such as restricting surgery within the retail space, limiting the number of locations an optometrist may practice at, and requiring the optometric office to be in a separate room of a retail store. Optometrists are currently not allowed to practice in those retail stores. So one thing you'll learn about our presentation here at the State Chamber is we like to go out and gather information from both sides and actually look at what supporters and opponents are saying about these state questions. The first one would be, what are supporters saying about State Question 793? Let's see if we can get it to move. This measure, the supporters are saying, this measure creates better access to health care for a population who might not have sought out access before, removes a business regulation, and promotes convenience for patients. Opponents are saying State Question 793 will diminish the quality of care. This isn't about health care. This isn't about health care for Walmart. They're only concerned about increasing profits. So as we've gone around the state, we've actually done about 35 to 40 of these presentations. This is one where we get a lot of questions about what this is actually going to mean. So to step back and actually look at, right now, an optometrist could actually locate within those stores, but this physical change will require, or no longer require, that there's an outside entrance to the building for the optometrist to perform their duties and their their things in terms of eye care. So with that, do we have any discussion or?
Well, I think one of the other things that has come up in some of the presentations we've done around the state is
Sure.
that I think 47 states have done some version of allowing these new types of retail outlets.
That's correct.
And
so the only 3 states that don't are Delaware, Rhode Island, and Oklahoma. So basically, there are 3 states that don't allow this type of activity to occur. Some of the other comments that I've heard one last night in Duncan, and they were asking, well, what's the difference between an optometrist and a pharmacist? And I thought that was an extremely interesting conversation that actually occurred between myself and a member of the Silver-Haired Legislature.
Well, and I'll tell you, we had at a recent County Farm Bureau meeting that very same debate, and they were saying in the old days, the pharmacist, when you had independent pharmacists, knew the different medicines you were taking. They were a lot bigger player in the healthcare system because they could say, oh, you need to get your doctor to reevaluate this. You shouldn't be taking these together. Now when you're mainly got big box store
Sure.
pharmacists, they tend to be more of filling that. It's more dependent upon the doctor to have noticed those. And when we have several different doctors, that can be in question. So that pharmacy argument, depending on where you stand,
Sure.
can play either way in this.
And the way I look at this, if you would just want to break it down from a high level perspective, is convenience versus quality of care. And I think that is one of the things that is being discussed right now in the state of Oklahoma. Of course, all of our surrounding states allow for this type of activity to occur in the realm of optometry and for opticians. So it is an interesting debate, and I will say that we do a lot of polling and tracking in the State Chamber. This one looks pretty solid so far, but there is a lot of activity on the no on State Question 793 as well, as that continues to get closer and closer because we're less than 4 weeks out from the election. As we get closer and closer to that election date, I would suspect this one will tighten up.
And I would say on behalf of some of my optometrist friends, and I guess we ought to remind folks again, if you have a telephone on, please make sure it's on mute. We're hearing a little bit of background noise there, so for everybody's enjoyment, that helps a lot if you'll mute your phone. But some of my optometrist friends have pointed out that the quality of health care that you get out of Oklahoma optometrist is among the best in the nation because they require them to go through a 10-step process. You can't go in and just get a prescription for eyeglasses. They're going to check you out for overall health, and a lot of times through your eyes they can tell whether you have other kinds of diseases or other activity. And
Sure.
every optometrist will tell you about a certain number of cases they've got and told people they needed to go immediately to the emergency room or go to their doctor to get looked at for something. And there's concern about when you box store this type of care that you won't get the same level of health attention on the other things that can be learned from the eyes. So.
Sure, and I think, and that is also, I agree with you, that's something that's been discussed in terms of limiting their ability to do the full checkup, and that's something that optometrists have really focused on. I think that at the end of the day, this one's going to come down to the wire, and I think that some of the questions in and around the quality of health versus the convenience of allowing for multiple locations to actually occur is just going to come down to personal preference.
I think in summary on this one, State Chamber actually does not have an official opinion.
We are neutral on State Question 793.
And Farm Bureau has a resolution that says we support Oklahoma optometrists continuing to be able to remove foreign objects from the eye. And so we've tended to be supportive of, we have member resolutions that are in support of optometrists.
Sure.
So that kind of gives a pretty good wrap up on 793, I think.
Thank you.
Maybe you want to move ahead to 794?
Yes. State Question 794, of course, is Marcy's Law. And of course, the last state question we were just talking about is the only state question that you'll actually have on the ballot that was initiative petition. So all the other state questions that we're going to talk about from here on out have gone through the legislature. And
maybe let's back up for just a second. For people that don't know, initiative petition means they actually had folks that had a certain number of days. I forget whether it's 90 days or 120. There's a certain number of days that they're allowed to go out and get a number of signatures, and it has to be a percentage of the folks that voted in the last presidential or governor's race.
Right, depending on whichever cycle you're in.
And so that these days to get done in that time period, that usually means somebody, besides volunteer folks signing, it usually means somebody's paying money to help hire folks to get enough signatures. But so that first question on optometrist was an initiative petition. Folks actually got the signatures and got that on the ballot. These next four all came through the legislature.
They did through resolution. State Question 794 amends provisions of the Oklahoma Constitution to guarantee that victims have co-equal rights alongside those accused and convicted. The rights to be added and enumerated include right of notice of all proceedings and to be heard in any proceeding involving sentencing, parole, or release, right to talk with the prosecutor, right to reasonable protection, right to proceedings free from unreasonable delay, allow victims to refuse interview requests from the defendant's attorney without a subpoena. So what are some of the supporters saying about Marcy's Law? Marcy's Law would ensure that victims had the same co-equal rights as the accused and convicted, nothing more, nothing less. Prosecutors and law enforcement organizations from across the state support State Question 794. Opponents say Marcy's Law could undermine due process. So basically, as we're making these presentations, there hasn't been a lot of activity in and around the negativity on Marcy's Law. This one did move through the legislature, and I always start by saying this and kind of giving a sense of how the legislature looked at this legislative referendum. There were no votes on Marcy's Law as it moved through the process. The origination of Marcy's Law basically came from California. There was a victim of a crime that the person who was accused moved in a few doors down. It started a national conversation about basically allowing for additional victims' rights. Many of the rights that we saw on the screen earlier are in state statute today, but in states like California and others that have adopted it, of course, there are 5 to 7 states that could adopt Marcy's Law also. In those states, it basically overwhelmingly passed. And basically all this does is extend those rights to those victims, expand some rights to victims, and remove them from statute and move them into the Oklahoma Constitution.
And I think 6 states have enacted it so far, and as you said, 6 or 7 states are voting on it this November. At the same time, our state is is voting on it. So it's part of kind of a national trend.
It is.
We only mention on there the one opponents say that it could undermine due process. Another, I think one of the states that's already passed it, and somebody at one of our county farm bureaus was pointing out to me that I think South Dakota passed it, and then they discovered that there was quite a bit of expense, at least in their state, to try to keep record of all the victims and how to communicate back. And so South Dakota has come back with a legislative rollback of some of the things.
Sure.
Because they're saying that a second reason that's been a problem is just the manpower that it takes for a county or state.
Or a district attorney.
Right, to keep track of who all the victims are and where they're at, so that they can give notice if they're having a hearing or being released from prison or jail.
It's a very good point. Now, the one thing where maybe in South Dakota that they didn't have that our Oklahoma district attorneys have are a few tools like Vine and things like that that allow for some of that easily to be tracked. So that there are some differences within states, and some states are more set up to probably accommodate the additional manpower that it's going to take to actually run something like this. But from the perspective, that is one additional thing that we have heard, that the cost could be great and I would agree that the cost could be great if we were starting from scratch in terms of how to actually track some of the victims or the accused of crime.
And one thing that helps in our state is some years back we made a move towards one court. It's been an exciting ride sometimes getting all that software and hardware to work, but we did make a move towards a statewide court reporting system.
OSCN.
Which I think is a benefit in this compared to some states that may not have a statewide
Correct,
system.
and they use that system as well as Vine to help with, they have the ability to use those systems to actually help with making sure that this is complied with in our Oklahoma Constitution.
My wife and I were victims of a bad economic crime some years ago, and the federal system, they do have a system, and it's been of great comfort to us to get notices as that process moved along. And so I can imagine that would be even more meaningful for someone who's a victim of a
criminal act.
It's especially of whether it's rape or attempted murder or some other type of physical injury. So it's easy to sympathize and understand the need for Marsy's Law.
Probably one of the reasons why there was very little opposition in the legislature as it was moving through the process. There is some passion in and around Marsy's Law in terms of making sure that the victim of crime do understand and know everything that's going on within the criminal case that they're following. And that's, as we travel around, that is one of the issues that you see, they discuss, but at the end of the day, and I'm trying to give a little bit of a sense of where these actually stand. So far within our state, it looks like this one is polling extremely well. And without a organized opposition, which in the 6 states that you referred to earlier, Rod, those states didn't have really any organized opposition to the idea of trying to make sure that the victims of crime were up to speed in terms of what was going on within the case they were following.
And officially, State Chamber doesn't have an opinion on this one.
We did not take an official position on State Question 794.
The Oklahoma Farm Bureau does have some all of our policies are presented at the county level and then adopted at the state level by our members. So this is actually a policy that was developed by our membership. We recommend that Farm Bureau support legislation mandating the crime victim's surviving family be notified in advance and given the privilege to attend any or all parole hearings of the convict who committed the crime against them and is being considered for parole. So that's somewhat similar to part of what Marsy's Law does. So
Sure.
You can see, I think our members are pretty firmly behind this one. So.
And it makes sense. I mean, because anybody that's ever been a victim or been a friend of somebody that's been a victim has sympathy for that victim, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why this state question seems to be doing so well.
Let's move on to number 798. This is an idea that's bounced around in Oklahoma since I was a kid. I remember discussions
Absolutely.
about this. So this is not a new question. It's a question we've wrestled with for a long time, and it's finally made it to the ballot.
Well, Oklahoma is well known that we have a lot of statewide elections. We have 11 statewide offices that are elected. I think we've been as high as 23. But what State Question 798 actually does is just combines the lieutenant governor and governor on the at the top of the ticket. So it would establish a joint ticket for the top 2 statewide office holders, governor and lieutenant governor. If approved by voters, these offices would not be elected together until on one ticket until 2026. So I always kind of explain why 2026. Let's say, for example, we have Matt Pinnell and Anastasia Pittman who are running for lieutenant governor. If they are elected in 2018, their term limit would end in 2026, technically not affecting anybody that was elected in the year 2018, unless they decided to seek a different office, and then that office was to be sought by somebody else, or if in 2022 they were defeated as that office is up for re-election. But the idea around delay of 8 years is to allow for those that had already filed for office, already announced for lieutenant governor, to basically stay within the system they currently have, not unlike term limits. If you remember the implementation of term limits, the reason why in 2004 we had a large wave of legislators come into office, that was because term limits were voted on, but they said, let's allow for everybody that's currently in to serve that entirety of term limit.
So the authors were trying to say, let's make the decision about the idea, not about the personality.
Not about the personality.
Or the people that are in those particular spots. So it's
really good website.
Trying to free it up from those immediate issues.
That's correct. So what are supporters saying about State Question 798? Creates a more effective executive branch, allowing for unified vision and stronger leadership, working towards shared goals. Would make government run more like a business, where a CEO or business owner can select staff and assign responsibilities. Currently, our lieutenant governor's role is weak. Operates independently of the governor. This would ensure the governor can trust the lieutenant governor to help hold the 200+ state agencies, boards, and commissions accountable. Opponents, what are they saying? If this takes effect, there is not a set process for how the lieutenant governor will be selected, which may cause confusion. Voters currently do a good job of vetting the lieutenant governor separately from the governor. So, I mean, those are kind of what everybody's talking about in terms of whether or not this state question goes into effect. In terms of polling, and I will state this, during the first debate between the Republican nominee, Kevin Stitt, and the Democrat nominee, Drew Edmondson, both of those nominees supported the idea of 798. Governor Edmondson did give a caveat to that, basically saying that depends on how the legislature enacts it, as long as the nominee gets to select, which not all states have a lieutenant governor, so it's hard to track from a 50 state perspective, but over 35 states actually do elect lieutenant governor and governor together on the top of the ticket, very similar to what the president and vice president actually does.
And it varies. Most of those states, the gubernatorial nominee selects the lieutenant governor nominee.
Correct.
But there are some states where the party in a party event selects the nominees and may match up a governor and lieutenant governor. So I think that's what Drew was trying to indicate. If he was going to be the governor in a governor lieutenant governor team,
he wanted the opportunity to select.
He wants to pick who that lieutenant governor is. And this question doesn't specify how that will happen. So if you vote for this, you're going to have to trust the legislature to come back and enact how that lieutenant governor and the governor will be matched up.
That is correct.
And so that's the question, to address the first opponent issue there.
Sure.
The other issue that comes up a lot of times in this governor, lieutenant governor, for many years our state was pretty much an all Democrat party state, and so you'd end up with a governor that was a governor and lieutenant governor that were both Democrats. In recent years, you've tended to have mainly a Republican and a Republican, but we have had occasion of a governor from one party and a lieutenant governor of another party not too long ago, and so that
Brad Henry and Mary Fallon.
So that creates questions of does that governor trust leaving the state when the lieutenant governor is of another party? Do they, when that lieutenant governor would take over, are they going to do something that they disagree with? So there's lots of management questions that come into play if you have a governor and lieutenant governor that don't necessarily trust or like each other or have different philosophies. And so that's part of what is one of the main things that leads to support for this idea of a governor and lieutenant governor together.
Yeah, it's unified vision. I mean, anytime, think about it from our president, Donald Trump, and his vice president, Mike Pence. you usually don't hear differing ideas. There's usually some uniform leadership, uniform vision. And you referred to back to 2004, well, whenever I was serving, but it was basically from the year 2002 to 2010. We had a scenario, basically, I think it was, or maybe it was only 2008, but we had a scenario by which we had a lieutenant governor that whenever the governor, because of our Constitution, leaves the state of Oklahoma, becomes the acting governor of the state of Oklahoma, there was always discussion in the legislature talking about how, well, the governor didn't even alert Mary Fallin that he was leaving at the time because he didn't want anything to adversely occur. I remember a few situations where the governor would leave the state and the legislature would discuss budget specifically, and it might have even been a scenario in 2010 that actually occurred. But I think narrowing this down and really getting to the nuts and bolts of why the state chamber thinks this is important is for that uniform vision. You want to make sure that whether you know what the lieutenant governor's role is within our state of Oklahoma, the common everyday voter believes that the governor and lieutenant governor are 1 and 2. If they are 1 and 2, then they want them to go in the same general direction for strong leadership and a unified vision. And that's the reason why our OK 2030 plan actually adopted this reform.
And I guess at the national level, to use your President Trump and Mike Pence example, think of Vice President was Biden with Trump. Things are already pretty exciting with Trump, and
that would be extremely exciting.
So that's why there's a lot of people think it makes a lot of sense to have the governor and lieutenant governor of whatever party or philosophy the voters accept to be a team. And so you've already mentioned that the state chamber is supportive of this. Farm Bureau over the years, for many years, had this in our policy and have been strong supporters of it. At this particular time, it doesn't happen to be in our book either way.
Sure.
But I would tell you that personally, I think it's a very good idea, and I personally have worked for this for 30 or 40, maybe 50 years, so for a very long time. But officially, Oklahoma Farm Bureau doesn't have a policy on this, but I think that was a good scenario of the pros and cons, and
Sure.
hopefully folks can go forth and make a decision and know that it doesn't affect the personalities. It's a decision they can decide on philosophy for 2000 and what do we say, 16?
2026.
26. Hey, yeah.
So
we've already had 2016.
One additional thing I do want to throw out there, because the state chamber obviously engages the 23rd in Lincoln. One of the things we will be advocating for is a scenario by which we kind of talked about is making sure that gubernatorial nominee for the party gets an opportunity to select the actual running mate, because that gets to the unified shared vision.
And I will commit today, I think, on behalf of Farm Bureau members, that we will also be active at the Capitol to assure that. I think otherwise it defeats the whole purpose of this question. The goal that everybody has for doing this is to have that really be a team concept. Lieutenant Governor already is viewed as the leader of the tourism agency and serves on several other boards and
Sure.
commissions, but a lot of time there's a general consensus among state leaders that the lieutenant governor, if there was a real shared vision, could serve an even larger role and accept more responsibility if they and the governor were
working in tandem.
So let's talk about State Question 800. There, we're getting into the controversial
Fun one.
This is, a lot of people think this is maybe the most confusing of the state questions, and so maybe
I don't disagree with them. I mean, if you read the actual ballot title itself, State Question 800 is extremely hard to actually understand. So what State Question 800 does is sets 5% of existing tax revenue from oil and natural gas, gross production tax, in an investment fund called the Oklahoma Vision Fund. That would be managed by the state treasurer. Income from the fund would be placed in the state's general revenue fund to supplement and stabilize the state's budget. And that percentage is actually 4% of the corpus of the actual fund. And I will also state this before we move on to what opponents and supporters say. One of the first questions that we actually get in terms of what do you mean by 5%? Will that affect County ad valorem or those that are already dedicated? The answer to that is no. Basically, it captures the 5% that currently is captured by the legislature to fund in terms of all the different needs that they have. Those that are dedicated to roads and bridges, when from the origination of gross production tax, and those that are dedicated to school districts will still go there, not subject to the 5% actual capture. All right. So what do supporters say? Creates new revenue for the state without raising taxes on any family or business. Leverages oil and natural gas tax revenue already collected to insulate our state budget, protecting funding for core services in downturns. Nearly all other energy states have created similar funds dedicated to priorities like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and economic diversification. What are opponents saying? This measure will reduce the amount of money that the legislature gets to spend in the short term, and the Oklahoma Vision Fund is an unproven investment strategy that could be mismanaged.
Let's go back to a couple key points.
Sure.
Number one is I'm out around the state and at our different county annual meetings and hearing questions. The first big question that comes up most often is, don't we already have a rainy day fund? How is this different from a rainy day fund? And I think that started in like 1985 or something like that.
It did.
And so what does this do that the rainy day fund didn't do, or why would we not just modify the rainy day fund instead of creating another fund?
So in terms of the rainy day fund has an extremely different purpose. So the purpose for the rainy day fund is to help in the downturns of the economy. So think about 2009. Maybe that's not the best one because that was global. But in 2016-17, we utilized the rainy day fund tremendously. I view it a little bit like a savings account. Let's say that I'm driving to Woodward and all of a sudden I run over a nail with my tire. How am I going to pay for that? I'm going to pay for that because of that change in my economic outlook. I'm going to pay for that $250 tire to replace it, or however much it actually costs. I'm going to go pay for that out of my savings account with the permission of my wife. But in terms of what the Vision Fund is actually trying to set up is more like an IRA. It's more of a long-term vision. Number one, another specifically different change in terms of the rainy day fund is the legislature and or the governor can actually spend some of the money out of the rainy day fund. With certain provisions, you reach certain economic things. In no point ever could the corpus of this fund actually be dedicated. And
so only the interest earned off of this fund? Only
the interest. So I was just in Edmond at Rotary talking to Edmond Rotary, and there was a gentleman there who just moved from Wyoming. And a few years ago, the state of Wyoming actually set aside far more than 5%. They actually set aside 25% of their gross production tax, or their oil and gas revenue. And basically, they have not had a downturn. It is now the largest funder of state government in the state of Wyoming. Our research foundation is actually taking a look at what would happen if we would have set this up a few years ago. If we would have done it, let's say, in 1990. By the year 2018, we would have had enough money coming out of that 4% to actually give a $2,700 teacher pay increase, which would have got teachers to the regional average, and completely filled the amount of money the deficit that actually occurred in 2018 without a single tax increase, which I think is extremely interesting. And you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I'm a farm kid. My dad used to tell me all the time, when's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago. When's the second best time to plant a tree? Today. And I think it gets a little bit to that issue. Yes, is it going to cost money in the current budget year? It is, 5% of GPT. But I will also say that Ken Miller just came out with his recent economic outlook, and gross production tax in this given year is up 25%. They're looking at a budgetary number of probably over $1 billion. Now, a lot of that's spent, and a lot of it's going to go into the rainy day fund.
And there's a lot of people that want to get their hands on it.
And there's a lot of people that want to get their hands on it. But that leads to another point on the Vision Fund. They cannot actually get their hands on this 5%. In Alaska, this is actually a fund that they use and utilize as well. And sometimes they would actually pay some of their citizens a certain percentage out of that to basically help with some of the hardships that were with being a citizen of Alaska. I think that the legislature actually opened up, and one of the things they actually did later was close that back up because the legislature wanted to spend that on current needs. By showing a little bit of fiscal restraint, and looking towards the future, because we know that one of our most volatile funds within state government is gross production tax, because of the volatility of the price. Could go from $25 to $100 very quickly. This tries to offset that volatility.
The basic goal from everybody I visited with that's been involved in this, and I think John Paul Montgomery and several other legislators have been big proponents of this, is to take some of the high points off the years we have kind of bonus income from real high prices and GPT. It would reduce. We'll take that top off of that to go into this long-term vision fund, and then it would soften it in the downside. So the idea is to even out the highs and lows.
And one of the things that I always talk about, because, in the legislature, this was one of those legislative referendums, and John Michael and Senator Sparks, which, I always encourage bipartisanship. This is one that was truly bipartisan. The minority leader of the Senate and a sophomore member from the Republican up-and-comer from Lawton, just joined together and came up with this good idea. And that's one of the reasons why OK 2030 actually latched on to this idea, because we think that it makes a whole lot of sense. It relieves some of the pressure in the economic downturns, and in those good years, it actually grows faster to latch on to. I'll use a modified quote from Albert Einstein. It allows for the miracle of compound interest to occur. I think Ken Miller, in a recent economic report, also showed that Oklahoma is doing great in terms of investment. I think we were 6th overall in terms of how the state treasurer is doing in terms of investment on our pension funds. And I would love to have 11% interest on 5% of GPT, especially in about 20 years when the ups and downs could occur.
Two last questions on this one.
Yeah.
Some of the main groups that have been, or probably the main group that's been out of emphasis, has been some of the school board or school leader type groups.
Yeah.
And their concern, as I read their editorials, is they're worried about it taking money from the current spending year and could
Sure.
reduce their effectiveness to spend to education in the short term or to other causes.
Sure.
And the argument the other way is that you give a little bit up right now, but you dramatically improve things long term because of doing this IRA type savings account.
I agree. There is no doubt that this will reduce the budget in 2019. But let me give you a sense of what that truly means. If you're talking about 5% of the portion that the legislature actually gets to appropriate, you're probably talking, depending on what GPT does and continues to do, you're probably talking between 25 and 30 million bucks. Just to give you a sense, the state of Oklahoma in its entirety of expenses is somewhere between 20 and 25 billion. So, and the legislature themselves gets to appropriate $8 billion. So it is a lot of money to you and me, especially to me, but it's a lot of money, but we're talking about small portions over time can grow really quickly, kind of like we saw in the states of Wyoming and some of the other oil and natural gas states. And what we believe here at the State Chamber is that over time, this is going to become one of the major funders of state government, and it's going to offset some of the pressures that we currently have and some of the far ups and downs that we currently have as well.
From an agricultural background, this is kind of the question of do you believe in planting seeds or acorns?
Sure.
And what can happen from some well-planted seeds or acorns. And the one last question, but to make sure the anti-folks are properly represented.
Sure.
This was presented as a bill that the legislature acted on. The legislature passed it in both the House and Senate. It went to the governor. The governor vetoed this, or some portion of this. So why?
Right.
I get people that ask why, if it wasn't good enough for the governor, why is it good enough for the voters to vote on?
It wasn't actually this specific, because the legislative referendum doesn't actually go to the governor. It just goes through the House and Senate and then goes directly to the ballot. There was an additional portion that would have set up the funding mechanism, and realistically, we still have a year to actually do that. I think that there were questions, especially you have to think about the time frame. It was also in the month of April and right around the teacher walkout that occurred. So I think that there was a whole lot of discussion in and around the budgetary situation that they had just faced and how that was going to affect next year's budget, and fair questions to have. But as the outlook continues to shift more towards a positive outlook going forward, I think that some of those questions are being alleviated from the perspective of, are we going to be able to survive a 5% cut to the GPT, where last year and the year before, if you think about it, $800 plus million shortfall last year, over $1 billion shortfall the year before, $700 million the year before. They had gone through a long time frame at which there was a lot of anxiety around anything that would take any additional funds. As that has shifted, I think we're starting to get a sense that there is more willingness to think about putting some back for the next downturn.
And how to avoid this from happening again.
Will inevitably happen again.
Yeah. Okay, well, to wrap that up, the State Chamber is clearly for that question.
Sure, we are.
2030. Farm Bureau officially does not have a position on that, but in visiting with many of our Farm Bureau members around the state, I think most of them do believe in planting seeds and acorns, and I know I do, and so I think this is I personally am going to be voting for this, even though we don't have an official position on that, but I think it's a good way to plan ahead. And the last of the state questions, this is one where the State Chamber and Farm Bureau may not be totally in agreement, but
sure,
it's our chance to air out the issues here on 801.
Absolutely, and I think it was Ronald Reagan that said that if you agree with me 80% of the time, you're my friend. So in terms of State Question 801. It would change the way that school districts are allowed to use existing property taxes in their building funds. Currently, building funds are limited to use on construction, remodeling, landscaping, and maintenance. State Question 801 would enable local school districts to use these funds for school district operations, including teacher pay, textbooks, or classroom supplies. So we have pretty extensive in terms of support and oppose on these state questions. What are supporters saying about State Question 801? It empowers local voters, school boards, and superintendents to use money already in building funds, which is 5 mills, on local priorities. The outdated restriction has limited local tax dollars from being spent in the classroom for more than 60 years, and the vast majority of states do not have similar limits. State Question 801 will not raise taxes on any family or business, and it will not affect school bond measures. The safeguards that currently exist will remain unchanged. So, what are opponents saying about State Question 801? Passing State Question 801 lets state government off the hook for adequately funding education. Schools are already using their building funds for necessary expenses like facilities, maintenance, and janitorial services. This will only put additional pressure on these funds. If local school boards and superintendents make poor financial decisions, it could lead to an increase in the number of school bond measures.
And the State Chamber has been out. This is one of the 3 state questions that you all are promoting. And
sure.
And for our concern from officially, we don't have a policy on this because we had kind of conflicting policies of allowing local control, and one of the things out of this state question, if the voters pass this still doesn't happen unless they come back in their local school district and vote for this. So it's really a 2-part deal. The state question we passed, which would authorize local districts to make the decision on whether to divert their bond funds. So it would become a local decision in whether that 5 mills is still tied to the bond fund or whether to free it up for these other operational expenses. And then our concern from a Farm Bureau standpoint is that there's many school districts that need these funds to be taking care of their facilities, and we're worried that if they divert to paying teacher salaries or operational expenses,
sure,
and that goes on for several years, that building expenses will be neglected, and all of a sudden we have a crisis, and air conditioners that aren't working, or roofs that are leaking, or aren't replacing physical facilities that need to be replaced.
Sure.
And so then we'd have a crisis, and then there would be pressure to do new ad valorem taxes. And we appreciate that this question currently doesn't increase ad valorem taxes at all, but we're
right.
worried that 3 years or 5 years or 10 years from now, if we don't invest in our building funds make the building fund investments that we need to, that it will result in crises in many districts that then it will require.
Possibly could push it forward. And I definitely hear the concerns. I've heard them, when I was a legislator, I heard some of these concerns too, as it's been expanded throughout the years a little bit, to allow for some additional expenses coming out of the 5 mills that is currently collected from ad valorem. In terms of those decisions, and the reason why OK 2030 took position in favor is to allow for that local control, because ultimately at the end of the day, the local school board and the superintendent, if this were to go into effect, they would still have to basically make the decision to spend those dollars on other things. There are obviously going to be school districts that don't have additional funds within their building fund, and then there are going to be a large number of school districts that either carry over or have a tremendous ad valorem base. This simply just allows for those 5 mills, which is a small portion of their overall budget, to be utilized and dictated, kind of like what a business owner does. Or, for example, we had a hospital administrator who also has a building fund, and stand up last night and say, well, if I was limited in terms of what I could actually do with that fund, that I might not be able to actually save the local hospital, which is an interesting argument. But all this basically does is eliminates that requirement that it has to go to bricks and mortar, and allows for the superintendent and school board to invest in people.
There will be quite a bit of variation depending on districts around the state. Our state,
yes.
we have we have well over 500 districts in our state, and so there's a lot of variation depending on what their local ad valorem tax base is like, and what the age of their physical facilities, and obviously districts that have a lot of new facilities, they may not have the building maintenance pressures of a district that's an older district that is dealing with 1950 or 1930 facilities. So there is a lot of variation around the state with how some districts have the flexibility to where they could give it up for building easier than other districts where they probably need every bit of the 5%. Or 5 mills, not 5%.
Right, 5 mills. And I definitely see that. And, of course, as I was a legislator, you can see the different school districts and how they were affected. When a development went into a school district, you could see the boom that actually occurred within that district. So there is obviously, and we've heard from some superintendents about how this could create a little bit of an issue amongst different school districts, and depending on their ad valorem base. I do think that there is some discussion in the legislature talking, and this is something that, as we were doing our research, we found an existing building fund stabilization fund, which is interesting. Now, it's never been funded, but they actually contemplated the idea of having all this, because it not only becomes an issue whenever we're talking about this, but it also becomes an issue whenever we're talking about teacher pay. So if the legislature decides to put the $5,000 teacher pay raise, that doesn't mean or guarantee that the local school district itself, especially in western Oklahoma, which has a high ad valorem tax base based on wind, based on oil and natural gas, and all the pipelines that we have currently out and amongst western Oklahoma. But I think that there's been some thought about possibly doing some, and this was one of the thoughts from a senator, about putting some money into that to try to offset the difference between each individual district for those building funds, which I thought was an interesting concept.
And it's, as you say, since there's already a law that's there but not funded, it's an issue our state's wrestled with for a very long time. So I guess the pro on this is that it does give local control, at least from our perspective at Farm Bureau. The pro on this is that it gives local control. So each of those districts, if this question passes, gets to make a local decision whether they want to divert their 5 mills of building fund or whether they want to maintain it as 5 mills of building fund. The negative side from our standpoint is, besides the ones that you listed as opponents, is worrying about the impact 3 or 5 or 10 years from now if we don't properly maintain our buildings, and then suddenly find lots of districts that are in a crisis because of, an example that somebody was telling me was, if you don't invest in your house, you know, if you don't do the regular roof maintenance, and then all of a sudden you're in a crisis when water's poured in the house, the cost is far greater, and that's a scenario that we could set up with this. So that's the pros and cons and that issues that you kind of have to wrestle with and decide where you come down. Are there any other points on that one you want to point out?
No, we're good.
I think it's time to see whether we have any questions out there. We're gonna, so those of you can unmute now. If you want to ask a question, you can unmute your phone and ask us. And then to anyone who's emailed in a question, we'll be seeing what email questions we have in as well. So we've got we promised to wrap up in about another 10 minutes. So we've got about 10 minutes here that if you have any questions over the phone or over the email, we'll be glad to tackle those.
Rod, aren't most of the school boards, or many of them, opposed to this last question?
Mike and I will each take a shot. Sure. It's interesting. I think a lot depends upon the scenario of the school district.
It does.
And so as I've been going around the state, the question was, are most of the school districts opposed to this? And I would say of their leadership of the education groups,
I agree.
Most of the leadership of the education groups, I think, is opposed to it. When you're out around the state talking to individual districts,
and to school board members
and to
themselves.
School board members.
I think there's a difference there. School board members are probably still basically maybe 50-50 depending on the school district. The leadership of the school through the superintendent would be higher in terms of the negative.
Yeah. And by the time you get to the leaders of the state associations, it's pretty much unanimous against it, I think.
Sure.
So as you work your way down the tree, it's from pretty much unanimous against it at the state education groups to fairly strong against it at superintendents and principals and probably split at school boards. I think that's a good description. But
yeah.
So there's some real philosophical differences there you have to wrestle with to decide where you're at on that one. You got a follow up on that? I think I recognize Bob on that.
You did. No, that's what I was asking.
Okay. Are there any other questions out there anyone has? While we're waiting for any other questions, are there any on the computer that we've got to address? Just a reminder that you can vote in person on the election on Tuesday, November the 6th, from 7 to 7 at whatever your poll is across the state. Our state a few years ago did do early voting as well, so you also have the option of voting at your county election board on the Friday and Saturday. The Friday and Saturday before the election. So the Friday and Saturday before November 6th, you can go to your local election board in whatever county you're at. But I've always had people ask, well, aren't my polls open? The polls are only open on Tuesday. Your actual precinct polling place is only open on Tuesday election day. But
that's correct.
You can vote at the county election board on the Friday or Saturday before, or you can get an absentee ballot and vote absentee before the election. I've had a number of friends calling me that already have their absentee ballots and are calling. This is the time of year when you get questions on judicial races and on state question races.
Absolutely.
That's why we're doing the state question discussion today.
And I will also say that, this election is extremely important. Not only are we choosing a new governor, so no matter what, we're going to have changeover. And to kind of give you a sense, we're going to have changeover of 8 of 11 offices, minimum, could be 9. And then we're also, in terms of statewide elected offices, and we have a minimum of 51. When Senator Justice and I were elected in 2004, we had 52. We fully expect to probably have more than 52 newly elected individuals in 2018. To give you a sense, that's going to be far greater than 1/3 of the legislature, far greater than 70% of our statewides are going to be brand new with very little experience in government, and we also expect over 50% of our committee chairmen are going to be brand new as well. It's going to be a year of the new in 2019.
Well, and it's even more exciting than that when you look at how many years experience a lot of the new committee chairmen are going to have. We're going to have such a shortage of people with experience in the legislature that we're going to have lots of committee chairs that are just gonna be in their sophomore term and even a few freshmen maybe,
Sure.
so.
Well, it provides an opportunity at the same time it provides a challenge.
And on the statewide officers, when you mentioned how many changes, that's driven in large part because of our term limits on state officials.
Sure.
And so this is the first time that totally kicks in. So when we had the whole big new batch of state elected officials 8 years ago, that one or two of them left office for one reason or another before them, but that was essentially the whole crop changed out. And so now, with the exception of like labor commissioner, where we'd had a change during the time period, and I get one or two, the state attorney general has changed out during that
Yes.
time period. So we've got a couple that will.
And the state school superintendent
Yeah.
of public education.
Yeah. So we've had several that changed out during that 8-year period, but most of those are coming to the end of their term limits, and so that's why you're going to have a total new crop of whether the voters pick Republicans or Democrats. It's going to be a new face in those statewide offices.
Brand new face all the way around.
We'll do one more call for questions over the phone. Any other questions over the phone anyone has? Going once, going twice. Okay, any others on the computer there, Marla or Anna? Okay, well, I think that's all the questions. We certainly have enjoyed this chance to visit with you today. We hope we've given you a lot to think about. We have tried to share what both our opinion was at Farm Bureau and the opinion of State Chamber, but we've tried to give you a fair spin on the pros and cons on each of the questions to help you make a decision. We know it is hard to get information on these state questions, and so we've tried to be objective on this. We hope you find it useful. This is going to be shared for those of you that got to watch it or listen to it live. You can decide whether it's a product you want to recommend to your friends and neighbors, but it's going to be in a format that you can share over the internet or through Facebook or Instagram or whatever after it gets posted on YouTube here. It'll be in a format you can share it to others in your family and at work that want to know more about the state questions. So this is a fairly new use of this technology for both Mike and I. So if you have comments or suggestions or things.
But no criticism.
Yeah,
right?
no criticism. We don't take those, though, do we?
Right.
But if you have any suggestions or ways that we can do this kind of format better or additional information we need, we look forward to using this technology again in the future, and so we would welcome your input of how we can do a better job at it. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and don't forget to vote. I did just look up on the calendar on my phone here, and the November 2nd and 3rd are the days for early voting. So November 2nd and 3rd, you can vote early at your election board, or November 6th, you can vote in person at your precinct. And we hope you'll study the issues, study the candidates, and make sure and exercise your important responsibility as a citizen and get out and vote. Thank you very much for being here today. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Very much.
Thank
It was
you.
a wonderful visit.
Thanks.
Thank you.